As we begin the second part of the lecture on imports and exports, we will begin to look some at how the USDA carries out evaluation of shipments of food that's coming into the country. And then we'll look briefly at how a company in the United States, what information and procedure they would need to go through to export food to other countries. Again, we start with this particular slide that shows you a number of products. Certainly, many of these would be imported into the U.S. from various parts of the world. So here we go looking at imports and exports. So we're going to look at importing meat and poultry. The importation of meat and poultry, that meat and poultry and meat either as fresh meat or as processed products have to be produced under the standards that are equivalent to the U.S. And the three areas that have to be abided by if somebody wants to bring meat into this country certainly is food safety issues, the wholesomeness of the product, and then finally the labeling accuracy. So USDA, Food Safety Inspection Service, is responsible for ensuring that imports meet those standards, and the products that, at least some of the products that the FDA has authority over to the Food Safety Inspection Service, include those that I'm sure you're familiar with. But some of these products that could be imported into the country probably may not be familiar in terms of seeing these types of meat products certainly in normal commerce in the U.S. Horses and mules would be two that we probably don't see much horse meat or much meat from mules being consumed in the U.S., although there are segments of the population that certainly do consume these products. And if you go to Europe, a great deal of horse meat is consumed in some of those countries, Belgium being one, that horse meat is quite popular. Certainly horse meat would be very, very lean, low in fat. I think one of the reasons perhaps it's not consumed to any great degree in the U.S. is the fact that I think we think of horses certainly as being pets. And then guineas, guinea fowl, although guinea fowl are becoming more popular, not so much for imported poultry into the U.S., but the fact that a lot of people actually are raising guinea fowl for their own consumption and for sale at things like farmers markets. Processed products that contain more than 3% raw meat and those that contain more than 2% or more of cooked poultry meat, those fall under the USDA FSIS, not the FDA. Some products that you might think of that would fall into these categories that would be processed products. Some pizzas might fall into that category. Lasagna might be another one, certainly that might fall into that, where the raw meat content of those products would be 3%, more than 3%. And then they move from the FDA being responsible for those products to the FDA. The FDA also has authority over wild game, venison, that would be imported into this country. Venison that would be imported into this country could not be from whitetail, from mule deer, or for those two species are game species in this country. Fish, buffalo, and rabbits also fall under the under the FDA authority. So there's a sort of a break in the continuum here when we look at USDA versus FDA as it applies to some of these meat and poultry products. So how does a country become eligible to export their meat into the United States? A formal request has to be made to the Food Safety Inspection Service International Policy Division. And this group division then evaluates the country's inspection system. And two ways or two things that are involved in the inspection system. One is a document review, and we'll look and see what that entails as we look at some further future slides. And then an on-site review in the processing facility itself. So what's involved in the document review? Looking at the country's laws, looking at the regulations for processing meat and poultry within that country, because as we said, if they're going to be exporting food, meat and poultry into the United States, their regulations need to be comparable to USDA FSIS. And then other written information that may be available. And the focus of a document review is going to be on contamination, diseases that may be seen in poultry and cattle within that country. Certainly we'd be concerned if they have diseases associated with their meat and poultry animals that we have not had in the United States. Processing, to make sure that the processing is carried out to the same specifications as would be required for a domestic processor. Any residues, particularly looking at things like antibiotic residues that may be present that are not allowed in this country, and residues of other drugs that may be used to treat diseases in those animals. And then compliance and economic fraud. The on-site review, the technical team would evaluate the 5 risk areas that we saw on the previous slide, but they're also going to look at the facilities within the plant and the equipment that's used in that plant for processing of meat and poultry products. They'll look at laboratories, and this may be a laboratory that the processor has within their facility where they're actually doing some of the testing. As an example, they may be looking for the fat content of processed meat product to make sure that it's 30% or less for things like hot dogs and processed meat products that may be coming into the United States. Or it may be private labs that do the analyses to make sure that their products are in compliance. Excuse me, they'll look at training programs that are in place for worker training, and then they're going to look at inspection of the plant while it's in operation, so that they can make sure that it's operating to the same standards as a domestic processing facility would have to operate at. The Food Safety Inspection Service would periodically review the inspection systems of eligible countries, and the frequency is based on past performance history. If facilities in any country have had a lot of issues, they're certainly going to do a review of that inspection system on a much more regular basis than in a country where there has been no significant issues in the past. So approved companies for importation of meat and poultry are listed in the Code of Federal Regulations, 9 CFR 327.2b and 381.196b. If we look at how much meat and poultry products are imported into the U.S. each year, it averages about 2.4 to 2.8 billion pounds. And we might think if we look at those numbers, they're quite large, but that's less than 10% of the domestic supply. And the major amounts of meat and poultry that come into this country are coming from 3 countries, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Certainly if we look at lamb in the U.S. market, we're going to see that a good percentage of that lamb that we're purchasing is coming from Australia and New Zealand. There are animal health restrictions carried out by the USDA Animal Plant Health Inspection System, and it prohibits fresh, chilled, and frozen meat from coming in from countries where we have rinderpest or foot and mouth disease. They can't be exported. They can export commercially heat processed or cured meats. So cured and smoked meat could be imported into the U.S. From countries that have these 2 diseases, as well as canned products, where they're thermally processed. So what are these? Rinderpest is a virus. It's a very highly contagious virus of cattle, water buffalo, and has a very high mortality rate. We don't have this in the U.S., so these regulations are put in place to prevent this particular virus from coming in to the U.S. and infecting our cattle in particular, because we don't do a lot of water buffalo here. And then foot and mouth disease, or paramyxovirus. It's related to human measles, and it's highly contagious as well. Approval of the product label has to be brought about. Inspectors check both of the shipping containers that the product was shipped in, as well as retail packages, to make sure that it conforms to the labeling requirements that are in place for a domestic process as well. So they must meet all U.S. labeling requirements. This could relate to things such as the nutrient fact sheet, as well as ingredient statement, as well as labeling for proper labeling for our food allergens. Except for some single ingredient products, they must have pre-approved labels. Our domestic processors have to have pre-approved labels. That also holds for countries that want to import meat and poultry products into the U.S. A single ingredient product might be something such as ground beef would be probably a good example of that. The labels must be in English, and they have to include the following information. They need the product name, the establishment number. This would be exactly the same. This is for poultry, because remember, you don't. If you remember from the first part of the lecture, we now don't have to have country of origin for beef products. So the establishment number is just like the plant number that we have for all processing plants in the U.S. that are regulated by the USDA FSIS. The name and address of the manufacturer or distributor of the product or products. The net quantity of contents and avoirdupois or liquid measure. A list of ingredients, and then a handling statement if it's applicable. If you remember on our fresh meat products, there are handling instructions and cooking instructions that are placed on that label as well. U.S. Port of Entry procedures. Licensing is not required by the USDA. Importers may be agents such as custom brokers who must be licensed by the U.S. Customs Service. So this is a little different than with the FDA, but still the U.S. Customs Service is the one that the meat and poultry processors would be licensed with. U.S. Customs Service requirements, the same as for other foods, except the Food Safety Inspection Service requires 2 additional documents. So in addition to the documents that would be required for FDA products, the USDA FSIS requires 2 additional ones. It's an original certificate or a health certificate from the country of origin. It indicates that the product was inspected and passed. And then also Food Safety Inspection System Form 9540-1, and this is the Import Inspection Application and Report. FSIS further requirements, inspected by an FSIS at an approved facility. It enters the inspection info into a centralized computer system. It's called Automated Import Information System. And this checks to make sure the country, plant, and product are eligible for export to the United States. And reinspection is based on plant and country's compliance history. If they have a very poor compliance history, then there could be a reinspection, and this would occur within 72 hours of that shipment arriving in the United States. Inspection may be delayed or refused if documents contain irregularities or errors. The next thing they do is examine the general condition of the shipment and the labeling to make sure that it complies with U.S. regulations. And then they conduct inspection assignments as is directed by the computer system. Companies with a very good compliance history, the computer system may designate the shipment as a skip. It wouldn't be inspected. The meat and poultry products would be put directly into the U.S. commerce. Types of inspection that may be assigned by this computer system, AIIS, net weight checks for retail packages to make sure that the customer is going to receive the correct weight of product, so there's no misbranding by having the wrong weight on the product. Examination of container's condition to make sure that there would be no signs of pests, other types of conditions that would indicate that the product might be adulterated. Examination for product defects. Incubation of canned products. These would be low acid canned foods. Incubate these products at a little higher temperature than normal to make sure that they've been properly received the proper heat treatment. A laboratory analysis of products for composition, making sure that if it's supposed to be less than 30% fat in processed products, that it does, looking for microbiological contamination. E. coli would be one that they might look for, and again, they might look for particular pathogen, foodborne pathogens as well. Looking for drug residues that might be present in the meat, poultry products, and then making sure that the species is what it says it is. If it says it's beef, it needs to be beef. So they do this certainly quite often. Sometimes it's you can put in a cheaper type of meat into a formulation and then sell it for the higher price. The shipment is usually released prior to the lab results coming back unless that plant has a history of a number of violations, or if the USDA FSI inspector suspects that there is something wrong with that particular shipment of meat or poultry products. Shipments that actually pass inspection, they're stamped with an official mark of inspection, and they're released into the U.S. commerce. If the shipment doesn't meet U.S. requirements, the container is stamped U.S. refused entry. That means it's not approved for entry into the United States. And within 45 days, it must be either exported. Sometimes they may export it to another country that may not have as stringent requirements as we do. The product can be destroyed, or with FDA approval, converted to animal feed. You see, the USDA is involved in the inspection of the poultry product, but if it's going to be put into another animal feed, then it comes under the premises of the FDA. Reinspection of Canadian imports, based on the fact that the United States and Canada have a free trade agreement, and the countries have an equivalent inspection system. Instead of the FSIS Form 9540-1, shipments coming from Canada are accompanied by FSIS Form 9510-1. And they're faxed to the station where the product will enter the United States. They're not going to be re-inspected because they come in under facilities that are equivalent to the inspection facilities in the United States. So if you want to get further information on importing meat and poultry products from Canada, you go to the Importing Meat and Poultry from Canada, FSIS Technical Service Center in Omaha, Nebraska. FSIS regulations relating to meat and poultry can be found in Code of Federal Regulations Title IX, Parts 200 to the end. Title IX, Part 94 deals with animal plant health inspection system requirements. Certainly, if you've gone to other countries and you're bringing, as you enter the United States, or if you go through customs in that country, even in Hawaii, you have to go through, your baggage gets put through a screening system operated by USDA APHIS, and they're making sure that you're not bringing into the contiguous 48 states something that might contaminate products within the contiguous 48 states. Title 19, Parts 141 and 142 are the general U.S. Customs regulations as it relates to meat and poultry. And Title 19, Part 12, the U.S. Customs regulations for importing restricted merchandise, including meat and poultry. Certificates of export of foods. If you want to export a product out of the United States to another foreign country, You need to indicate that products are regulated by the FDA in this case. We're not talking about meat and poultry here. They're not subject to any enforcement action at that time by the FDA, and are not guarantees, certainly of product safety or quality, so certificates of export of foods. It's issued at the request of the U.S. company, so the company would request from FDA certificates of export of foods. And again, the FDA is going to indicate that the products are regulated by the FDA, and that the particular lots that you want to export are not currently under enforcement actions by the FDA at that time. For issuance, products must meet the requirements of 801E of the Federal Food Drug Cosmetic Act as follows. They meet the specs of the foreign purchaser. They're not in conflict with laws of countries to which it is intended for export. This might relate to the fact that you certainly would not put or try to export pork products into Muslim countries or into Israel either. Labeled on the outside of the shipping package as intended for export, and the shipment is not sold or offered for sale in domestic commerce. And each request should be accompanied by an original label or a detailed version of the current label that's being used, and then sufficient information so that a reviewer can properly actually identify the product that's to be exported. Identification of the actual manufacturer of each product as well. They're issued by the U.S. FDA Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition's offices. The Office of Pre-Market Approval is HFS 200 for export of food-grade chemicals and additives. The Office of Plant and Dairy Foods and Beverages, HFS 300 for exports of standardized and related foods, and then the Office of Seafood, HFS 400 for the export of all seafood. What's a certificate of legality? This is one of the questions you have for an assignment for this week. One of your clients asks you to provide them a certificate of legality for liquid tea extract concentrate. What is a certificate of legality? I don't take off any points for this. I just want to see what you come up with related to what an actual certificate of legality is. Be aware that it actually may not actually apply to any U.S. Regulations or laws. And finally, the trivia question for imports and exports is, what part of the banana is used to make banana oil?